Welcome to the Executive Innovation Show podcast, where we bring you real executive conversations with industry game changers and thought leaders. We ask the questions you're thinking, what you're scared to ask, and we make your brain hurt afterward. With your host, Carrie Chitsey Wells, co-founder and CEO of One Touch Video Chat, live video interviews, and the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the untapped workforce of the visually blind and HR tips for incorporating blind employees into your organization. Have a great guest with me today. I have Mike May, who's the executive director of the William L. Hudson BVI Workforce Innovation Center, an initiative launched in Wichita, Kansas early last year to tackle the 70% unemployment rate among people who are blind or visually impaired, and to really offer training, job placement, and accessibility. His career started in political analytics from the CIA and has founded a tech company as well, staffed almost entirely by individuals who are visually impaired. Mike, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
Great. Well, Mike, you were the subject of a really cool book called Crashing Through: A True Story of Risk, Adventure, and the Man Who Dared to See by journalist and New York Times bestseller Robert Kurson. Can you tell us a little bit about your story of the chemical explosion and about partially getting back your vision at 46?
Sure. It's really it's amazing that we call it coincidence or serendipity happened to me in two significant parts of my life. When I was 3.5 years old, living in Silver City, New Mexico, a mining town, a bizarre set of circumstances came about where I got some calcium carbide out of the garage, put it in some water. That turned into a gas, happened to be next to some burning garbage, so a spark hit that acetylene plume and blew me sky high. Wow. I ended up in the hospital for several months. I had over 300 stitches in my little 3-year-old body and was lucky to live, ended up totally blind. So fast forward then 43 years, I'm 46 years old, and I happened to go into the doctor's office with my wife to get some contacts updated of hers. And they said, well, why don't you talk to the doctor here and, see what he thinks about your eyesight. And so I did that. I went through the exam, and lo and behold, he says, hey, there's this stem cell cornea transplant arrangement. You might be able to get some vision and be able to see. We don't know how much or a lot, or will you be able to drive or read? But after a lot of consideration, because life was good, I didn't need to have sight, I decided to go ahead with the surgery and had that happen, and I was able to regain some low vision. And that leads up to the book Crashing Through, which was chronicling that whole experience in my life that surrounded going from no vision to low vision. Just one of 20 people in something like 200 years who'd had that dramatic of a sight restoration.
And so what does it mean, low vision? What actually can you see today?
Well, mine is kind of strange because I always thought of vision as kind of low, medium, and high. And in fact, neurologically, there's a lot more going on. As it turns out, with my vision, I can see colors nearly as good as you. Wow. I assume you have good color vision. And I can see motion well. So if something's moving, I see it better than if it's stationary. I have no depth perception. I can't read print, can't drive a car. I use a seeing eye dog because I can't tell a step from a hole in the ground or anything else that's in front of me. So I can use my vision to look around and be useful for landmarks, but it's not particularly good for a lot of detail.
Right. Wow, that is such an amazing journey. I have to admit that before we talked, I really wasn't aware of the unemployment rate for people that are blind and visually impaired, and really all the challenges that go into with getting visually impaired folks into the workplace. tell us a little bit about what really makes visually impaired workers such great employees, and for the HR folks that are listening, why they should really consider visually impaired employees, as a, pool of potential job candidates.
Well, the statistics speak for themselves. If you think about it, there is 70% unemployment among the blind, 70%, which means there's a lot of blind people who are hungry and educated and interested in being employed, but for a host of reasons, they have not been employed. So you have this pool, and it's untapped. That's the first thing. And then the second is that if you look at a number of different professions, particularly call centers and customer service and so forth, the retention rate among blind workers is much higher than with your general population. So those are two good reasons. Those statistics alone are reasons to really tap into this resource.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as, for an HR person that, is wanting to kind of tap into that pool and so forth, what's the biggest challenge for, visually impaired folks that are seeking employment, like during the interview process, trying to apply for kind of a normal, job posting?
Well, I know from my own experience when I started job interviewing out of graduate school, and I had a pretty impressive background, but I didn't have a lot of job experience. I just had good education. And everybody that I went in to interview with said, "Oh, you're amazing, and I think there's probably a job for you in this other department." And I kept getting passed off. I wasn't turned down, but I was passed off. And my classmates were getting jobs. And so a lot of it had to do with the fear, the natural fear that people have who are employing you. The managers are looking at they might not even think of this. They're scared. There's the unknown of, oh gosh, how's a blind person going to do this? And when they try to figure it out in their own head, and they have their own visceral response to, oh, if I was blind, this would be impossible. I couldn't even get myself to work on time.
Right.
That's where you stall out, and that's why you have this 70% unemployment. A lot of it is just the fear factor in the attitudes of sighted people.
Yeah, no doubt. And when you think about the, kind of that fear factor, I think it's, a lot of the fear of the unknown, because in order to get, for anybody, just a new employee coming in, not even a visually impaired employee come in, there's so many internal, systems or technology, just like the office environment of a new person coming in from an HR onboarding perspective. What are some of the things that, kind of the top 5 things that HR folks should be thinking about to break down some of that fear of, what needs to be considered, whether it's an HR system or a benefits system or whatever it may be, to really, if they're going to invest in visually impaired, that they, need to think about?
Well, right out of the blocks, the thing that has changed is a lot of interviews and screening happening online. So the first thing, number one, is making the interview process accessible. Does the website have the ability for a blind person to log in and follow the same prompts and fill out the application as a sighted person would? So that's the first thing. Once the blind person gets in the door, then it's really focusing on what is that blind person's skills. Let's interview them, find out what they can do. Are they appropriate for the job? And too hung up on the accessibility issues, because the sighted person is not going to know anything about accessibility, most likely. The blind person interviewee isn't going to know a lot about the position. And so it's a bit dangerous when both people don't know these two parts of the equation. But let's focus on the skills, which is number 2. And then it's having a can-do attitude when hiring and accommodating a blind person. So from the get-go, when you bring that blind person in the door for the next stage, okay, let's interview with more people and think about how could this job actually be accomplished. If have employers who are saying, I'm sure there's a way to do this. I don't necessarily know how, but we're going to get our best people on it and we're going to figure it out. That in conjunction with the blind person and with organizations like Envision, like ours, that help facilitate employment, we will figure it out. There's no doubt. There's very few jobs a blind person can't do. You can't fly an airplane. Blind people are doctors. There's blind people doing everything. So it can be done if you get the best people together to figure it out. And then it's a matter of acquiring the necessary tools. So maybe some additional software is necessary. For a low vision person, it might be a large screen, might be a braille display. Sometimes the employer participates in buying that. Sometimes the blind person has it with them, or they have a grant or their state funding. That's not a barrier either. Once a job is on the line, it's usually feasible to figure out how to get the tools in place. And then it's asking the blind employee what they need to be successful, because every blind person is not the same. The visual acuity varies a lot from person to person, and if the sighted employer is trying to guess and be super accommodating, they might be putting a lot of effort into something that a particular blind person doesn't even care about. So that's, when you think about it, these are all the same kinds of things that you would be doing with any employee, potential employee, because we're all individuals, and that's the same thing with a blind person.
Yeah, I think those are some amazing tips, and I think, when people really kind of, boil it down to, what does any employee need to be successful in order to get, to keep that employee retention, and, obviously the attrition rate, it sounds like it's significantly less for blind employees. The barriers and the investment, will more than pay off. You've done some amazing things lately on some grants that you've gotten for your Workforce Innovation Center, really to be the most extensive employment-centered program to really train blind and visually impaired folks and place them into skilled positions. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing and the types of, positions and industries that you guys are really focusing on that, have proven to be successful.
Well, first off, we have a training facility, so maybe the blind person needs a little bit more experience with particular screen reading software, something that would get them up to speed when they come in the door at a particular employer. So that's what we might call the job readiness. And we do that in Envision, and there's other places around the country that do that kind of job readiness. And then we're really looking at three types of situations that we might train people for. Working here in Envision in our call center, working in a local industry, so we have a local bank going to be placing some people with. We have a collection center, and they're in desperate need of more people to collections. It's not always the most exciting work for every person doing collections, but you get the right person, and it can be super valuable. And so we can provide training to help be the stepping stone for that blind person getting into that local collections agency. And then, of course, if you get a remote job, a blind person might be able to work from home. And this is true for anybody. And when you're in rural America, or particularly if transportation is an issue, as it might be for a blind person, then working from home can be a much more efficient way, and you can stay in your particular town, or you don't have to relocate. We do relocate people to Wichita and to our facility in Dallas, but a lot of times people want to work from home, and so we're trying to facilitate that.
Yeah,
and we have other, manufacturers we're looking at, an appliance manufacturer that does both work at their facility, and they have remote. We have a satellite receiver company that we're doing a contract for right now. It's email support. And so we're trying to look at different kinds of high-tech jobs, and it's really across the board in terms of industries where people need customer service, and that's where we're focusing to begin with.
Yeah, that's great.
We also are creating some of our own products, like a hotline for accessibility, where companies can't afford to have their own accessibility division, then we would provide the support on that particular project, whether it's a refrigerator or a cable TV box. You think about it as a sighted person, those things are just, you just operate them and it's no big deal. But for a blind person, you might need extra coaching in using those products. So we can hire blind people to do that, at the same time helping create more customers for that manufacturer.
Oh, that's really cool. Never thought about it from that angle, but it makes total sense. And one of the things I really like is, regardless of, having an initiative within a company to, reach higher quality candidates and reduce attrition and so forth, everyone's kind of looking for, high quality candidates. And, really the quality is critical. But sometimes, from an HR perspective, as we just talked about, and the experience that you had is, they're interested in you as a candidate, but just kind of the fear of the unknown, and it can be overwhelming. You guys are doing consulting and helping companies kind of really take that burden off their shoulders and saying, hey, let us help you figure it out. Let us learn a little bit more about, the company and the systems that a visually impaired person might have to interact with. Talk to me a little bit about how that works and, how that works for HR folks that are listening, that, you guys can assist in that regard.
Right. So we understand pretty well the full range of possibilities. We have blind people working in our manufacturing facility here, a couple hundred people in Wichita and 100 or so in Dallas. And so we've accommodated machines to make sure the equipment works properly. But sometimes there's facility things that would be helpful too, to just make that person's job more enjoyable, whether it's how do you access a vending machine or a coffee machine? You don't need to get sighted help for that. Or maybe there's some wayfinding things around the company. These are not showstoppers, but they're things that can help the blind person to operate more efficiently and make the job more enjoyable. And so we really know those things from A to Z and can go into a company and say, oh, by the way, all you have to do is put a Braille label on this particular machine, or you get a bump dot and put it on a button, and all of a sudden something that was inaccessible becomes accessible. Companies, if you don't know what you don't know, and where we really step in and provide that kind of expertise.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think, that could be a big, help and, eliminate a lot of the obstacles of, everybody has obviously fear of unknown. So that can definitely help in that regard. One of the things I never had thought about, coming from, having owned a call center and having done kind of customer service and call center outsourcing, my whole life, we're always, as call center professionals, trying to, figure out new ways to reach high quality candidates. And a lot of call centers are moving to, work from home and, not having these big brick and mortar call centers anymore, but, staffing folks and having much higher employee satisfaction with being able to work from home. Tell me a little bit about, for why call centers is such a sweet spot for visually impaired, and why it's such a great, probably, alternative to, outsourcing offshore or something of that nature.
Well, for one thing, there's numbers in call centers, and we'd really like to, if we're going to make a dent in this 70% unemployment, we need to be hiring 100, 500, 1,000 blind people. So you think about different call centers. I mean, this one appliance manufacturer we're talking to, they alone have 1,500, and I don't know, they had something like 1 million touches a year. So there's super high volume, which means there's more demand for employees, and we can hopefully fill that demand. So that's one reason we're doing that. Also, you think of customer service and phone work. That's something that lends itself well to a blind person. And, other jobs might not be as great, like selling products driving around Kansas
Yeah.
might not be the best fit for a blind person in terms of accommodation. So that's why we're focusing on call centers, and we think both the opportunity and the success will be good for blind employees that we can point in that direction. And we also have our manufacturing folks, and some of them would like to have some upward mobility and move out of manufacturing, and this is a natural stepping stone for some of those people who have other skills and more gregarious.
Makes sense. You guys have some great stuff coming on the horizon in 2019. What should we be watching out for the rest of the journey for you guys this year?
Well, in 2018, we were really getting started. We opened our facility in the middle of the year, June 7th. So we have this beautiful 12,500 square foot open space facility with these computer stations that are just begging for people to sit in the seats. So it's really, in 2019, it's all about transforming our beautiful facility into an active location. We have some activity, but we want to see it just brimming. And then converting our other preparations into real activities, like the product hotline. We also want to do some training in other tech areas. For example, see a lot of the companies like Apple and Microsoft that are making programming easier, and they're looking at alternative ways for people to get trained because they can't wait for 4 years for a person to get a computer science degree. So you have, for example, the Apple Swift Playground, which enables a person to learn how to be an iOS programmer in a much shorter time. There's apprenticeships where people, instead of going through your traditional 4-year program or even 2 years, it's more vocational oriented, and they might learn to be a programmer within 6 months or a year. And we'd like to be a facility that offers those kinds of escalated programs to get blind people into tech jobs.
Yeah, that's really cool. I never thought about that, being a techie myself. Yeah, some of that programming, and obviously that's where the world's headed. So that's really cool. Well, we'll definitely be following your journey this year, Mike, and in the future. What an amazing story, and it's so great that you're giving back and helping out others really get into the workforce. And to all my HR friends and folks that listen, it's definitely eye-opening, and I hope this podcast has really opened up your eyes to consider the visually impaired for open positions that you might have within your company. And if there's any questions for, about this podcast as we close up, for Mike or the visually impaired, please let us know. Mike, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast and sharing everything with us today.
Thanks for having me. Workforceforall.com will get people to our site, and I'm looking forward to hearing from people and seeing what we can do together.
Great. Well, this podcast has come to a close. Feel free to rate the podcast, submit any questions that you might have on today's topics, and we can get those answers from ourselves or from Mike. And feel free to share the love of the podcast. Thanks, Mike.
This podcast has come to a close. To hear more from the Executive Innovation Show podcast, subscribe, submit questions, and share the love. Follow us on social. We're everywhere.